Hello, everyone. Welcome to the conversation. It is a privilege to introduce Beate Andres to our community here, our global community where we have more than 100 plus people tuning in. A lot more people in the community that would continue to have this conversation after we finish talking. Beate is a special representative to the UN and the Director General of the International Labour Organization's Office of the UN. She has an impressive resume and many achievements. I hope we get to talk about some of them today, her journey during her tenure at ILO and how she made her way through each one of them. I'd like to bring up one of them. She played a very key role in the launch of Alliance 8.7. The 8.7 talks to the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Member Nations, all of us, came together and set up goals to reach by 2030 so that we have a more sustainable society. Goal 8 refers to decent work and economic growth, and Target 8.7 talks to eradicating forced labor, ending modern slavery, human trafficking, child labor. I'll let Beate talk about the alliance part of it. I'd also like to talk a little bit about something that you might not find on our official bio. So Beate, I've seen you talk on multiple forums, the plenary session, the Pathfinder workshop, and two words stood out. They continue to stand out even today. One was change. You talk about how change requires many trials, and it can take many years in coming. Even on something like forced labor or ending forced labor that all of us would just simply agree upon. And the second that stands out is talk, that governments, organizations, workers, employees need to talk to each other if we are to find a way forward towards a more resilient and equitable society. And that tees us up nicely for the theme today, where we want to have the conversation around tackling inequality through fair wages at home and abroad. And we're hoping for a really good conversation around this complex topic, hearing not only your struggles, but also things that help having some successes on the ground and where we are headed in the coming decade. So welcome, Beate.
Thank you, Vidya, and really thank you for inviting me to this unscripted leadership session. It's a pleasure to be here virtually.
So to kick us off, during the times that we live in right now, every day seems like an emergency. Every day we are dealing with constraints, with things not working, with things that we did not plan for. So what does a day look like in your life? What does a day in the life of ILO look like now?
Well, Vidya, thank you so much to get us right into this discussion. Of course, working for the ILO is, I've always seen this as a great privilege, but also as a big responsibility. Because we have a presence in many countries around the world, including in countries, as we can see now in Afghanistan, where the security situation can change from one day to the other. So we, as ILO staff, but also, of course, same applies to my UN colleagues, we have to be extremely foresightful. We have to be able to anticipate what the future brings. And unfortunately, the times in which we live in is a time of profound crises, protracted crises, but also new emerging crises for which we have to prepare. Now, where I'm placed personally myself right now is in heading the ILO's office in New York, as you already said. And here in New York, of course, our main responsibility is to be the liaison with the UN, to make sure that the UN's crisis response really includes ILO's concerns, ILO's constituents. And I think, as you and many of our listeners will know, the ILO is the only UN organization that has non-government members as constituents, workers' organizations, employers' organizations. And in particular, workers' representatives, trade unions, they are often in the first firing line. They are so at risk when governance structures break down. So we have to be very much in sort of joined up with the UN and the security mechanisms that are available to be able to offer the best protection that we can. So that's the sort of the function of the office here in New York. It's really the liaison with the UN on all matters. Of course, also to represent ILO's vision, ILO's policies in major UN bodies like the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, but also in the UN General Assembly and in other bodies. And with the UN reform and the Secretary's general vision for a much more inclusive and networked multilateralism, of course, the ILO is very well positioned to play an active role in as we are, shaping our vision for the future. So yes, our hands are full. A lot has to do, when you look at my day, a lot has to do with sort of immediate responses to the daily crises that we see. But we are also working on sort of, we are also part of the long-term visioning and planning for the future. And now coming to our topic, which is specifically on inequality and how to address issues related to also socioeconomic recovery from COVID-19. Here we are working very closely with the member states and with the United Nations to bring this issue really to the center of the debate here in New York. I'd hand over to you again, Vidya.
That's very interesting. So 2020 was when the UN celebrated its 75th year,
That's
right?
Yes,
But 2019, ILO celebrated its centennial year. So it is older than the UN, which most of us are aware of the UN. So how does that work? How does that interplay work between where we usually think, and this also comes to what ILO does and what could be some of the perceptions out there, right? How does ILO and UN work together in trying to get to these kind of situations in member countries? And where does then the State Department within the US or labor ministries or trade organizations, where do they play a role in these kind of conversations?
Well, first of all, anniversaries are always a good occasion, for better or worse, maybe, to reflect and to see what, where have you come from, where do you want to go? So it's not a time to pat yourself on the back and say, oh, great, all fine, but it's actually a moment to reflect and to say, what can we learn from the past and how will the past shape our future? And this is precisely what the ILO did in 2019 with our centenary. We look back, we went, actually, I myself enjoyed very much going back to the archives and reading some of the original documents when the ILO was set up after the First World War with the peace treaty of Versailles. It is fascinating to see how problems 100 years ago they're still with us today. And some of the solutions might be different, but some are, the toolbox we have is still pretty much the same. And I can come to this later when we discuss, for instance, how the topic of wages or other issues. So yes, it's a time to reflect, and for the ILO, the centenary was also a milestone in terms of our constituents coming together, governments, workers, and employers organizations, including, of course, the US constituents. The USCIB, AFL-CIO, and the Department of Labor, of course, also working with the State Department, but the Department of Labor is the primary entry point. And that tripartite setup is what we have in most of our member states. So it was a time also for our constituents to come together and to discuss and to negotiate a new political vision of where they want to go. And this is what came out at the International Labour Conference in 2019, the Centenary Declaration on the Future of Work, which provides a roadmap really it's first a document which reflects again on, as I said, on the past, on the vision of our founding fathers and mothers, but also on the vision of where we want to go today in light of climate change, in light of unfolding crises, in light of the technology changes that we see, in many countries now, this, how to overcome the digital divide and so on. So it has some real meat, so to speak, on issues that are of key concern to businesses, but also to workers and to governments. So I would really recommend you looking at the Centenary Declaration. This is the ILO's vision also and I won't say for the next 100 years to come, but at least for the next decades to come. And then, of course, COVID hit very shortly after the adoption of this resolution, which, by the way, was, or declaration as we call it, which, by the way, was then also adopted by the UN General Assembly in September 2019. So in this way, it has also become a UN-endorsed document. Now, then COVID hit and really turned everything upside down, but also reconfirmed many of the urgent priorities that were set out in the Centenary Declaration. In particular, the focus on social protection. That issue now has come really front and center of the political discussions everywhere, including here in New York. But also the importance of technology. As we see, this is kind of what kept us going through the COVID crisis, but it has also increased inequalities, the lack of access. And of course, the importance of jobs. And as we say, decent jobs. There's millions of jobs lost around the world, in particular in the early months of the pandemic. So it's been a very challenging time, which then culminated, as you rightly said, with the UN's 75th anniversary, which we celebrated. And yes, I should say we celebrated last year, because after all, despite all the setbacks, it's also a moment to celebrate that we have been able to set up this multilateral body that fosters cooperation. So the 75th anniversary of the UN, as I hope many of our listeners will know, was preceded by a very active outreach, like what the UN called global dialogues, reaching out to millions of people around the globe. And as I said, hopefully some of our listeners have engaged in this discussion to see what is it we want from the UN, but also what do we want in terms of how the world should look like in the next 75 or 100 years, and also more short term in the next 10 or 20 years. And interestingly, when you look at those results, the issue of jobs and the issue of inequalities, those socioeconomic issues, they're really on the top of the list of people's minds. Very closely also followed by climate change and other major concerns. But it's not surprising because, of course, what holds us together as a society is our ability to thrive and first of all to survive, but also to thrive. And so jobs and income, livelihoods are absolutely fundamental. They are fundamental to our societies. So we have engaged very, very closely with the UN on this discussion on what we call the common agenda. Mm-hmm. And next month, the Secretary General will launch a report on the common agenda. And I think that's really something to watch out and to look at.
No, wonderful. And when you think of jobs, like when you bring up jobs, especially in today's conversations, it is very hard to not think of what's equitable. What when you say decent jobs, what do we mean by decent jobs? On one end, we have an issue that we don't have enough workers. And on the other hand, we have an issue wherein it was those very workers for whom there was not enough protection. And so there's always these two conversations that keep happening in parallel, perhaps in their own silos, right? Wherein we talk about, have we gone too far with protection such that we don't have anybody, or have we gone down too less such that people have been left vulnerable in the workforce? And many industries, critical industries, you might think. So for example, there was this group discussion with the Food Distributors Association, and we have the school year opening right now. They just don't have people to be able to work so that we can get the school lunches and get the meal plans back on track, which for most part you would think is essential, which also provides a protection for the more vulnerable population who are in that school age, in the inner district schools. Right? But then a year back, it was for the same very worker, there was this conversation, we didn't provide enough protection to them. So how do you make sense of this when we start talking about how do we move forward?
Well, Vidya, you're opening really some very interesting lines of reflection. So, especially the way you've put your question, is it too much protection or too little? So first of all, there is still a persistent jobs gap worldwide. And despite the fact that you just mentioned, especially in the US, the situation we currently have, where you have a labor shortage in certain sectors. Yeah. But globally speaking, I just want to stress that point. We have a deficit of employment, not just to say decent employment. I'm saying general of jobs, generally. Mm-hmm. And this has been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. So the latest estimates of the ILOs are that the equivalent of more than 250 million jobs have been lost, full-time jobs have been lost due to the crisis. And some of these jobs will never come back. Mm-hmm. We've got to prepare for that. So that's the first thing to say, that overall, there's still a jobs deficit. And we believe, the ILO's position is that there needs to be active investment in labor market policies to stimulate demand, to stimulate, in particular, the creation of employment in sectors which we believe are relevant for society, such as the care economy and such as what we call the green economy. That's where we see a big potential in the future. But it requires public investment. You've got to have stimulus bills, and some of the, in particular, Western industrialized countries have adopted those measures in recent months in response to COVID, which is commendable, but it's by far not enough. And it's certainly not enough when you look at it globally. When you look at, in particular, emerging economies and developing countries, the investment gap, or what we call the fiscal stimulus gap to create employment is in the trillions. So we are really not at all responding adequately. And therefore, what the ILO has done in recent, over the last year, I would say, we have actively engaged in the United Nations initiative, which was launched by the Secretary General and by Canada and Jamaica here in New York, to look at financing. The initiative is called Financing Sustainable Development in the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond. So financing the Sustainable Development Goals, that's been an issue that has been around for many, many years. I mean, in particular, since the adoption of the goals in 2015, and in parallel, there was also a discussion on financing. So that's not a new discussion. But what is new today is that you've seen, in particular, major economies responding to the crisis with stimulus packages. And this, as I said, it's very positive to see this, and it has certainly helped mitigate some of the worst impact of the crisis. But that's not matched by a similar investment in developing countries. And so we fear that there will be a widening gap globally where you'll see a disconnect really in development, and this will also have an impact on supply chains and global trade. So we are really encouraging any action that can be taken to create more fiscal space in particular in developing countries to respond to the jobs crisis, but also to the social protection crisis. And the health sector, of course, is now front and center of our concern.
That kind of leads also. So I'm going to pivot a little bit because you do talk about what governments can do and what capacity building in nations can do, but there's also something that businesses can do and markets can do. And this part about where we see the gaps, where we see the lack of investment, and how we can make those investments. It's not just any one, but together we probably can fill that gap. So let me pull a bit about the role of investing in your supply chain as one of the ways that we can, at least where we talk about socially responsible supply chains, having companies being responsible not just for what happens within their four walls, but also responsible for where their products come from. And that as a means towards, it's not one action is going to fill up that gap, but each and every action is, it probably can lead up to some part of it, right? And a lot of our community, so a good reason to bring this conversation here is because at business schools around the world, we teach supply chain. It's one of the core parts of the curriculum. And we value things like flexibility, responsiveness, adaptation. Even right now during the COVID crisis, companies that were able to fill orders, have products, were the ones that we look for. Any one company or business that was completely shut down, that did not diversify its risk, they were criticized. But what gets probably not talked about is investing in your supply chain, not just in the tools and in the processes, but also the social investment that you make in the supply chain. And I'd really like to hear from your perspective, where does that go? How does that happen? Why that is actually good for the supply chain, good for everybody in the chain, rather than just as a giveaway or as a, as a price that you pay for operating in a global supply chain. Why is that? Why is a global supply chain that's also socially responsible actually good for all of us?
Well, Vidya, let me respond to your question again by looking at the pre-COVID time and then what's happening now in terms of supply chains. And of course, I don't want to imply that the world is really pre and whatever there's no post-COVID, but whatever world we live in right now. But I think there's a bit of a difference here. So what we've achieved pre-COVID was really, as you also said, growing consciousness on part of business that investing in your supply chains in terms of first understanding your supply chain, that's the first challenge for many businesses, understanding your supply chain, but also taking active measures to mitigate adverse human rights impact in your supply chain is good business. And there have been, there's a really growing body of research that shows that actually you benefit as a company from investing in these supply chain measures, both in terms of, as I said, in terms of monitoring and your supply chain, but also in terms of engaging with partners to find real solutions. Let me take this example of child labor, because this is what I know best, child labor and forced labor. Under the Alliance 8.7 that you already mentioned, we have created opportunities for businesses to engage. We have set up platforms for businesses to engage on those issues, not just kind of at a global level in conferences to make nice talks, actually in real terms, to actually go down to the country level where things need to change and where you have as a business leverage. Sometimes your leverage is limited, but in many cases it's actually bigger than most businesses would think. So we have actively created this opportunity for the UN, through the UN, for businesses to engage. And this continues, and that's positive. And we have seen in some of the research we've also done, specifically on child and forced labor, together with the OECD and with UNICEF, that the worst human and labor rights violations are often at the lower end of the supply chain, and very often actually in the informal sector. So it's not, and this doesn't come as a surprise, I think, to anyone, but it was good to see hard evidence of it in cross sectors, that actually the risks comes in when at this kind of sort of the intermediary part, often you have these labor intermediaries, and when you have informal suppliers who you don't quite know. Overall, the percentage of child and forced labor entering global supply chains is not as big. It's in the two-digit numbers, but it's not huge. But of course, any of those cases is a huge risk for business. So it doesn't need to have sort of a huge presence of children in your first tier supply for you to be vulnerable. And I think that perception of vulnerability has really sunk in, and has there have been enough cases, I think, also to demonstrate the importance of human rights. Now, again, looking at the current context with COVID, what we are seeing is that supply chains are actually very vulnerable to global crises. And, with looming climate change already impacting many areas where, in particular, resources come from, with shifting geopolitical alliances, it will become more and more important for businesses to understand and to work with the sort of political side or the public side of countries, I mean, with governments, and the UN can also help here, to navigate those global risks. And I think one response we are seeing now, because of the disruption of global supply chains, closure of borders and so on, that again, workers pay the highest price. An example here is the situation of seafarers who have been stranded in the first months of the pandemic, have been stranded very often on boats for months without the possibility to get on land. This is an example, again, where the UN was also at its best, because we've been able to advocate and to bring this to the highest level of attention so that governments would change regulations that would take into consideration seafarers and really treat them as first responders or essential workers and not just any other workers. Just to give you a concrete example of the sort of the daily struggles we are facing. And the situation of seafarers, I mean, I'm picking this as an example right now, we are far out of the woods here. I mean, we are still just now, as we are entering the next session of the UN General Assembly, we are looking back into this question: what have we achieved since last year, and what needs to be done? So it's just an example of how vulnerable global supply chains are and how much it then impacts workers in particular.
Very true, and there's everyday news about how the supply side is still constrained. But when we think of that, and this depends on what our daily life is and what our work looks like. But for most of us, we do think of, okay, the ships are not coming. The ports are not open yet. I don't think a lot of us think about the seafarers who are not able to get off the ships or were on there for the reports that we heard while I was there was around 12 months more stranded. No port willing to take them. You couldn't disembark. You were going off from one ship to the next one, and those issues. And you don't see them until later in the day when we think of it as a capacity problem, but there's that humanitarian crisis that's also there. That needs that effort and policy and support.
Yeah. Of course, as consumers, we are concerned about our cars or about our new latest telephone. Why don't we get it? Because there is a supply crisis. As businesses, you're concerned about your production capacity. But we also have to look at the worker side of the story. And that's really, you could see that with the impact of the crisis, many workers who've been laid off initially, they were the most vulnerable informal sector workers, but also, government sector was also a case in point, and they are those who have the least resources to survive on. And there are no systems in place to help them. And that's really what came to the fore with the COVID crisis, the lack or the weakness of social protection systems in many countries. That there were no safety nets. But again, to focus on the positive side of it here, because it has made it so crystal clear that these safety nets, or what we call social protection floors, they're not a luxury, they're actually essential for the survival of many people. It has really helped to build political momentum around the issue. We will launch our next global report on social protection next week. So we will see the new numbers now coming out of what governments have done to invest in social protection systems. And again, coming back to businesses will benefit from this. Because if you have systems in place where workers are insured, where you know that they are not totally falling through the cracks, or they will be protected some way or the other, you have a much more stable environment to operate in, and you will have skilled and motivated workers to come when you start investing in increasing your production capacity. So I think it's also it makes good business sense. And we, as you know, the ILO is advocating a system that is really based on contributions, a solidarity system where everyone chips in, their employers chip in as well. So we need businesses to come to the table on this issue affecting global supply chains, but also what we haven't discussed yet on the issue of wages. Wages are a primary source of income, and if you have a fair wage to start with, you can maybe make some savings and you can actually plan for the future.
So let's get right into it. The concept about child labor, forced labor, these are things that I think this broad agreement, we shouldn't have it, or we should be careful. The conversation around fair wages seems a lot more murkier. Right. So the top concept, when we get into it, when we talk about if we have a fair wage system, it would help build up over the years this concept about resilience, this concept about social protection. So when a crisis does come, it doesn't leave the people vulnerable. It requires, it's nothing that you can, it's not a post-Band-Aid thing. It's rather what you put in as resources ahead of time and let it grow, so that you're prepared, like you would do with any resilience kind of an initiative, right? But how does a business have a conversation about fair wages? How do you have that conversation with first within your organization, and second with your supply chain on what fair wages would be, especially when you have so many numbers and words getting thrown out right now, right? You hear minimum wage, you hear living wage, you have alternate wage. So how does the business have this conversation?
Well, first of all, Vidya, I mean, whatever wording you use to describe the issue of wages, what is important is that you have a mechanism in place, transparent mechanism in place, or what the ILO in some of its instruments calls wage fixing mechanism or system, that it gives workers a voice. I really think this is the bottom line. So it's really important to start with. If you look at this topic, you have to have freedom of association and collective bargaining in the first place. Now, freedom of association and collective bargaining is one of the ILO's fundamental principles and rights at work, which means they are non-negotiable. They are universal, and member states have to respect those rights regardless of whether they have ratified the respective conventions on freedom of association and collective bargaining or not. So ratification, it's in the numbers of the conventions, if I can just put it in here, it's number 87 and number 908, if you want to look it up. But we have distinct conventions that member states would normally have to ratify. By the way, the same way that we have two distinct conventions on child labor, on forced labor. On forced labor, we also have a protocol which was recently put in place to update the issue, and we have 2 conventions on non-discrimination. Those conventions are really, as I said, just to repeat it again, that's a universal standard which you cannot negotiate if you're a member of the ILO. You cannot opt out, you cannot choose not to respect them. Now, of course, the reality is a different one, as we know very well. But I just want to stress that point that, if you look at wages, you've got to accept that child labor and forced labor are unacceptable forms of work which have to be eliminated. And by the way, in both instances on child and forced labor, what often motivates non-compliant businesses to use child and forced labor is precisely the economic benefit, because the wages they pay to children or to forced laborers, if they pay at all, are not at all competitive. And we have measured this some years ago, and we are actually updating those numbers on the economics, how much illicit business actually gains by not paying, by treating people in very exploitative ways, forced labor, child labor. So that's it. It's no coincidence, I would say, that freedom of association, collective bargaining is part of this package of conventions that also includes child and forced labor, that really are sort of the bottom floor that we need to put in place in a country in order to promote fair, adequate wages, whatever word you choose to use. And unfortunately, in many countries, we are far from a reality where this is the case. And I haven't even mentioned the aspect of non-discrimination, because in many sectors, in many countries, we know that wages are also discriminatory. We still have a persistent gender pay gap of about 20%. So we need to understand that issue. But we also have a major pay gap, though we haven't measured it yet, in relation to certain nationalities or ethnic communities. So it's clear that these fundamental universal standards, they have to be implemented and they've got to be accompanied by strong institutional and governance mechanisms. So now turning specifically to freedom of association and collective bargaining. So if you have a system of freedom of association, meaning that you have free and independent trade union in representing workers in a particular sector or even cross sector, then you have a force that can negotiate wages with the employers. And this is really the DNA of the ILO. This is why the ILO was set up 100 years ago, is to really promote that system of what we call social dialogue, and specifically here also collective bargaining to enable workers to get a fair share of their work. Now, in many countries, these systems are broken down or have not even existed. In many sectors, especially in the informal economy, you don't have those systems. So one of our main priorities is to help our constituents set up those mechanisms. And let me give you an example that I think was also discussed a lot in the US. It's the fishing sector in Thailand. There there have been really massive problems with labor rights on onshore and offshore, including forced labor, and where when we started working there, when we started looking at this problem, there were no independent trade unions representing workers in the fisheries industry. Now, we are still far from a reality where you would say we have collective bargaining there, but we've actively invested in supporting workers, and many of the US-based organizations have played a key role here, supporting workers to set up some form of structure, some form of organization, including, by the way, through the global trade union, which is in this case the IOF, in the ITF, where you can actually help workers to negotiate. So this is just one sector, which initially was highly informal, but which has progressively formalized, and this now needs to also come with the systems of wage bargaining. But there are many others. I mean, where, look at bonded laborers in South Asia, where we are so far from a system of collective negotiation of wages. So that's really on the side, and I think the public, government can play a key role because they are of course the employer in the public sector, including, as we now see, in the health sector, where the issue of wages is key. If you don't pay fair wages, then you will have, of course, a shortage of workers. So there's again this whole question of financing. What is important for us? Where do we put our money? What is it worth to have a good qualified domestic worker in your house you can trust? What is it worth to yourself personally? We've got to ask this question, all of us.
These conversations tend to be more like debates in a lot of places rather than actually talking to each other and finding that solution forward, right? And it elicits a lot of emotions from different constituents and different people, especially around how do we get these kind of, how do we get an agreement and the financing to work together to get to the desired kind of outcome. It's really hard to imagine any business going in and saying, I want to exploit people. You don't see that. But the unintended consequences that end up happening because of actions that get taken in silos. We could talk for hours together, but at the same time, I do know that there are questions coming in from the audience. So let me take a couple of questions that are coming in. And for people who are on the webinar, there's a Q&A function there where you can ask your questions. We will try to get through most of them, and if we don't, we'll find a way to revert back to you. But let me just take a couple in right now, Beate, if that's okay with you.
Sorry, Vidya, do you want me to take the questions? Or?
No, I give you the questions, and let's just go with that for now, right?
Okay, good.
So this is from Eduardo, and he asks, due to COVID, the unemployment rates grew more than 10% in developing countries. How can we build back better if we can even just barely build back with such high unemployment rates when it's just struggling to survive?
Yeah, I mean, Vidya, first of all, we don't want to build back. We want to build forward. We want to really what our DG said, build a better normal. I mean, it's a lot of the problems we face today they're actually linked to the broken system we've had pre-COVID. So let's really take this crisis as an opportunity to look into those systems. So clearly, my first response here is no, we are not just barely building back. I mean, this should not be our ambition. And it is clearly not the ambition of the UN. And I would say this has also has been expressed by many governments that speak in different UN fora. So building forward better, what would it mean? And particularly looking at the employment scenario is, as I said earlier, is to really create the fiscal space to allow governments to invest in active employment policies, and to invest in sectors that these things hold a promising potential for job creation, such as the care sector or the green economy. Now, for this to happen, you need these global fora to allow, in particular, developing countries to have access to financing. And I would say because of this really global response, we've seen now, in particular on part of the international finance institutions, a remarkable response, which we have not seen, I should say, in previous crises, which I'm referring here specifically to the IMF's decision to create special drawing rights or allocations for developed countries to respond to the COVID crisis. So now we have to make sure that with this additional money created, the investments are made in the right manner. And part of it is also related to skills, which was core and center to the ILO's future work discussion. So if you want to invest in these new emerging sectors, including in technology, you also have to have systems of skills, of apprenticeship systems, but also higher level education and so on that support that kind of transformation. So clearly, we have a lot to invest in, and these areas of investment, by the way, if you're interested, Eduardo, in looking at this further, you should watch the United Nations General Assembly in September. We will have a high-level event there with the Secretary General where we discuss the issue of jobs and social protection.
I like that. Let's not just build back, let's build forward. With the kind of investments that we are making, with the kind of crisis that we've seen, the pain points that we have seen, let's talk to that instead of just going back to the old way of doing and padding, which has typically been the response otherwise, right? And how do we do that now going forward? That's where all this communication and conversation, and from a business perspective, when it's really hard to think what an individual business do, that's where ILO comes in, and your work with the governments, with the UN, providing that foundation and the framework to fall back on can be really helpful, right? So just before we came on the call, you were talking about the recent situation in Afghanistan. And that's front and center on all our minds, but it's front and center in your mind for a very different reason. It came about providing what does security mean for the people who are on the ground at these, some of them fragile economies, a country that are just coming out of conflict or probably receding a little bit in that with the loss of democracy voice. And there's a question there from Karen who's saying, what is ILO doing in response to the crisis in Afghanistan in the evacuation of labor leaders? So you're right in the center of it, Beate. So why don't you?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Vidya, and to Karen for this question. I can't comment on the specific of the response right now, actually precisely for security reasons. But you can believe me, we are really in the midst and center of it, and this is what really predominates my day or these days. And this is really an issue of concern to the leadership of our organization. And this is not just in the most recent crisis we see unfold in Afghanistan. This has been the case in Myanmar. This is the case in many other countries where we see, sadly, labor rights defenders really being in the first firing line. And what I said earlier. And it's important to understand that when we engage in a country where the security risks are looming, that we need to have protection measures to the extent possible. And perhaps one way to respond to the question is to say that the UN reform, I believe, brings many opportunities for the ILO to actually be more, I won't say embedded, but maybe in sync with the UN's security response overall. Because as you know, we are not deploying military personnel, we are not deploying police. I mean, this is not in the ILO's mandate or capacity. But the work that our constituents and our partners do on the ground actually, we believe, have a direct impact on the security situation, and in a positive way, we would think. And this was exactly the reason why the ILO was set up. It's to promote peace through social justice. Let's just not forget that. And so if those who promote peace, our labor, the labor unions, but also businesses who are trying to do the right thing, if they're then in the front line and firing line, we have an obligation to do whatever we can do to protect them.
And that's also one of, so ILO's work is not just SDG 8, that's right. Cuts across so many others. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, and again, you can see this in Afghanistan. It really cuts across. I mean, women rights. The whole issue of infrastructure, education. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals they come as a package. You can't, pick.
Pick and choose.
You cannot pick and choose.
Right.
But goal 8 on decent work and sustainable economic growth is kind of in the center when you look at the SDGs,
Right.
So we really stress that point that goal 8, decent jobs, decent work, is really fundamental to building peace.
And do you see, and this is tying into a question from Sunil, do you find political willingness globally to get all the things that you want in the labor scenario happen in the foreseeable future? So, for example, sustainable development goals with a target of 2030. But do you find willingness in the political theater that we are in right now, where a lot of nationalism is happening around, we want these jobs in this place, we want to protect the people, and they sound good, they're good sound bites, they get votes, there is a lot of immediate gratification to those statements, but oftentimes it can happen at the expense of other countries. It can happen at the expense of what we think of promoting peace and justice on a global scale. So is there political willingness to work together on these issues? Or has that kind of gone down over the last few years? You would expect a pandemic to bring people together.
You would think so, right? That a crisis brings us together. But unfortunately, I think what we've seen in recent months and years is actually also an erosion of solidarity and of collaboration. And it's so fundamental that we use all the resources we have in our toolbox, all the mechanisms we have to restore trust in confidence in institutions, both at the national level, but also at the global level. Because without those institutions, which essentially facilitate, they provide the platform for us to come together, we will indeed see, I don't think you need to have a crystal ball. We will see sort of a sliding back into nationalist, and we see it already, and nativist and sort of very dangerous trends, including social unrest that will then fuel conflict and war. So my plea here today is really whether you decide to go, or whether you are from business or you want to go into the business world, whether you are from the public sector, whether you're from civil society organizations, we all need to come together and to invest and build institutions that enable us to collaborate. And these institutions need to be backed by finances. We need to mobilize, and I come back to the discussion we had earlier, Vidya, we need to mobilize both public and private finance to restore trust and to strengthen mechanisms of collaboration in the labor sphere, but also more globally in the on security issues, on gender issues, and so on. So we think here also in the UN in New York, we think that there's a lot of untapped potential in particular in the private sector to mobilize those finances. And we hope we can also provide a forum through the UN here in New York to help businesses to channel their resources towards the right outcomes that we all wish to see, and essentially the sustainable development goals. And we need the political will. I would say that recent statements that you've seen coming out of the G20, G7, but also of the UN, they have been rather encouraging. I think at the political level, we are seeing a greater consciousness that, vaccine nationalism, if I can use this example, is not helping anyone. We've got to come together. We need fair vaccine distribution in order to overcome the pandemic. Yeah, and the same applies to jobs. If you manage to get your labor market back into shape in the US, that's great. But if you don't do this if you don't help this to happen in the other countries, your supply chains will be broken. you will not get the resources you need to actually, produce what you want to produce here. So I think this consciousness of our interconnectedness and also the vulnerability and fragility of the world in which we live in, I think is really there. Now it's the question to act and to really, as I said, come together and follow up on our commitments.
And hope that we don't have the same conversation, or we're not at the same place when the next crisis happens. Beate, we have a couple of minutes left, and it's like I've talked to you many times, but even from this is not just a job for you. You're passionate about this. This feels like it's your passion. You want to make a difference, right? You have that path forward that you forge in face of such big challenges. What would you say to someone who would want to work in this space, who would want to also want to make an impact while at the same time make good use of their degrees and their credentials? How do they get started?
Well, first of all, this is not a 9-to-5 job. If you have this on your, on your career path, then forget about the UN. And I would say this really applies to most of my UN colleagues who are deeply passionate and committed and driving themselves hard to do what they can. In particular, as I said, in crises we see evolving now. So you've got to have that. Maybe you call it an inner flame or that passion, to keep you going. Otherwise, you'll be burned out very quickly. You've got to understand that, what you do is maybe a small piece of a puzzle, but you need to be able to see that piece. Otherwise, it can be frustrating sometimes, because we have sometimes breakthroughs which we celebrate, but we very often have setbacks and we feel our limits, and this can be very frustrating. But you've got to keep going. I mean, we have to have the hope that what we do will make it a better world, and that's really the hope. But on the basis of that hope, the UN was created and the ILO was created. So we need to keep that hope alive. This is the first thing I would say. Now, more specifically, if you're working towards your degree and you want to be part of this more want to be engaged more closely, I mean, there are many paths to take. You can, of course, see for opportunities in the UN directly, either with the ILO or with the UNs who, internship programs, fellowships, and so on, and career opportunities that will be available. Not easy. As I said, you've got to have this passion to keep you going. But there are also many other ways to engage through businesses, labor unions, civil society organizations, in government, of course. So there are many paths to take. I think it's important to understand where's your competence, where do you see your contribution, the contribution you can make, and then I think you will find your place.
And right before we started this call, I remember you said, "No, I might get a security call. I probably can stay for an hour out of it, but not beyond that, given everything that's happening on the ground." And we are at an hour. So I'd like to take this opportunity and thank you, Beate, for being with us. This is a complex conversation, and this is a start of that conversation. What I do hope is that we have a very engaged audience that will take this, that will start thinking on these lines of how do we build a resilient and equitable society for all? How do we engage with our supply chain partners, within our own organization, but also within our broader society? And how do we think of this while we're also thinking of climate change? We're thinking of managing crisis. We're thinking of how the next 10, 15 years would look like. So thank you so much, Beate Andres. We hope the very best for you going forward and for many more such conversations to happen.
Thank you, Vidya. Thank you really for giving me that space. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I would really thank everyone who's posted questions and encourage you to be in touch and to keep thinking and discussing those issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. Stay safe, stay well.